All right. If y'all can hear me, I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to say how proud I am of all of y'all, those encouragements. One, the things that people were doing that they were being encouraged for are just so cool. And I think being in COVID and being more separated, it's been hard to like see what God's doing. So it's so cool that y'all did that. And I just appreciate people who took the time to encourage people. Appreciate Peter taking the time to organize that. I just want to start by having you kind of reflect with me. So you might notice that the slide there says Flashback Friday, Fear Edition. And yeah, so what I want you to do is to think back to a time where something alarming was going on and you felt fear. Maybe you were nervous to do something. Maybe you were in danger. Maybe there was some form of uncertainty that you were facing. But yeah, what was that situation? What was that season in life where you felt fear? How exactly did that feel? What was that like? And then how did that experience of fear, how did that feeling affect the decisions that you made? So, yeah, I want you to keep that in the back of your head. I'm going to be honest, I straight up don't have my clicker for the slides. I think it's on the table over there. One of the things I'm afraid of is like messing up while doing something. Thank you very much, Peter. Yes. Without any further ado,
Previously on Deep Dive.
gosh, I just love it. We got a professional for it. Sounds great. Yes, cool. Previously on Deep Dive, we did Mark chapter 4, and it was parable week, right? We didn't do the last several verses of Mark chapter 4, and we just focused on these parables. The main parable that we focused on was the parable of the sower, the seeds, the soils, all of that. And we kind of talked about how the different types of soils in this parable represented the different kinds of responses that different characters had in Mark, right? That it was like the legend in the corner of a map that as you read it, you're like, oh, like the disciples are like the, shallow, rocky soil, right? And so we talked about that. We talked about the parable of the lamp on a stand, how you don't cover it, you keep it uncovered, and how this kind of shows that things that are secret are meant to be unveiled. Well, Jesus comes right out and says that. But we talked about how that kind of represents a lot of the secrecy going on in Mark. And then finally, we kind of ended by talking about those back-to-back parables, the growing seed and then the mustard seed, or the mustard seed growing into the tree. And we just talked about the idea of how growth, there's a mystery to it. And if we check our hearts and find that we really do want to love God and serve God, that there's a message of encouragement just to be patient and to know that He's working and that we're going to grow, that we're going to bear fruit in time. So, yeah, kind of a unique thing. But yeah, it was parable week. But now we've got. Oh my goodness. Okay, do you remember the first chapter, how we talked about being dropped into like a whitewater rapid stream, and it's like, it's like that again. So much stuff is happening. My goodness. Such a hard talk to write. It was way too long initially. So yeah, here are the things that happen. We're back in miracle mode. So first of all, Jesus has just finished speaking. He's been doing all this stuff. These events from the first 4 chapters of Mark are kind of building up on him. And that evening, he tells his disciples, like, let's cross the Sea of Galilee. And they take him along, and he's so wiped out that on the sea, as they're crossing it, them and a few other boats, he's just asleep. And there's a storm, and he sleeps through the storm, which is insane, right? Yeah, and he's still asleep, and they wake him up, they shake him awake, and they say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And Jesus, I imagine him just kind of wiping the sleep out of his eyes and being like, "Oh my goodness." And he basically tells the weather to shut up. Says he got up, rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And then Jesus turns to the disciples and he responds to their accusation of not caring with a question of his own. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Right? And no sooner have we recovered from that story than they kind of set foot on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They're in a different Gentile region that, depending on your Bible, it's either called the region of the Gadarenes or the Gerasenes. But yeah, they get out of the boat, and then pretty much immediately, this man who has an impure spirit, who's demon possessed, runs up to Jesus. And the description of this guy is terrifying. Like people in the area have tried to chain him hand and foot, and he's broken the chains. Wouldn't be surprised if he was harmful to people as well, considering he lives like among tombs and screams and cuts himself with stones. Terrifying. And he runs up to Jesus, which if I was Jesus, I'd be terrified. And he falls on his knees. And he starts pleading with Jesus because Jesus has commanded the demon to come out of him. And he's like, "Please don't torture me. Don't send me out of this area." Jesus asks for the demon's name, and he says, "My name is Legion, for there are many of us." And then he sends this demon into a herd of nearby pigs. And the pigs go full lemming. And just a Roman legion is thousands, but it's also a phrase for just something, a lot of people, a lot of something, right? And so we don't know how many, but a lot. An entire herd of pigs just runs into the sea, probably past Jesus, and just drowns themselves, which is insane. There are herdsmen in the area, and they're like, "That's different." And so they go to the nearby town and just the countryside as a whole, and they tell people this is what happened. And the people come and they see the guy who they were used to screaming, who they're just like, "Yeah, don't go near the tombs." He's sitting there alert in his right mind, talking with Jesus, and they're actually terrified. They're like, "What in the world?" And then we're told that they find out about the pigs all dying, and at that point they plea with Jesus. It's the same word for the demon begging. They plea with Jesus to leave the area, but the demon-possessed man pleads with Jesus to get to stay with him, to follow him, and Jesus is like, "No, I want you to go back to your people and tell them the mercy that God has had on you." And we're told that he goes through the Decapolis, which were 10 super important Greek cities. He just goes throughout there telling the good news. So pretty insane transformation, if I do say so myself. The next one up is we've got another sandwich. If you remember, sandwiching is this thing that Mark does where he'll tell two stories simultaneously in order to get us to see the relationship between them. And so he'll start one, tell the other, and then finish the one that he started. And this happens when Jesus crosses back over the Sea of Galilee. He gets out. There's this huge crowd, and this synagogue leader named Jairus comes up to Jesus and falls on his knees and starts begging him. He's like, "My daughter is very sick. She's dying. Please come with me." And so Jesus is walking, and as he's walking, this whole thing is this journey to save this man's daughter is interrupted because a woman who has had some form of problem with bleeding, we'll talk more about that in a second, for 12 years and has tried a bunch of doctors and has suffered under their care. She's kind of snuck through the crowd, and she's thought to herself, "If I can just touch that cloak, then I'll be healed," right? And so she goes there, touches his cloak, and Jesus stops and he's like, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, everyone touched you, Jesus. It's what are you talking about? And Jesus is like, "No." And he keeps looking around, and the woman's like, "Oh no," he knows, he knows that it was me. And essentially, and we'll explain why in a second, but she falls down terrified. She's trembling with fear. But then Jesus looks at her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be freed from your suffering." But it says that as Jesus is still talking to her, which Jairus is probably sitting there on the side, like, she's been bleeding for 12 years. My daughter might not even have 12 minutes. Can we get a move on? While this is happening, people come from Jairus's household and they're like, she's dead. Like, you don't need to bother him anymore. He's obviously very busy. But they keep going. And Jesus tells Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. And they get to this household, and only a few select disciples enter the household. And there's all these people like scream crying. Back in that day, they literally had professional mourners that would come and help people express their grief. And so there's people grieving loudly. And Jesus is like, oh, she's not dead. She's only asleep. And they laugh at him, which, like, I don't know about you, but if I was like actually weeping, probably wouldn't laugh. Anyways, they laugh at him. And so he's like, he shoos them out and then goes up to the little girl and just grabs her by the hand and says, little girl, get up. And she's like, okay. She starts like walking around. And these two stories are connected in a few ways. There's fear and faith going on, but there's also the fact that the woman has been bleeding for 12 years. And we're also specifically told that that girl is 12 years old. It's rare for the Bible to use numbers for like no reason. And so, yeah, kind of a connection there. So, I don't know. I feel like for the first 4 chapters of Mark, we had kind of been building up this rhythm where each chapter we got more talking from Jesus than the last, right? And by chapter 4, it's mostly Jesus talking. And then it's almost as if you ever listen to a song and like the beat switches up and you're like, oh, we're going here now. It's like that. So we've been building up to teaching, and then it's just like parables. And then we're back into like miracles, and there's new instruments at play. There's new themes that get introduced. So yeah, kind of feels different. So here's kind of what I would like to do. And that is, okay, so if you've ever used Photoshop or really like any good photo editing app, there's layers to it, right? And so you form a complete picture by putting one layer on top of the other, right? Another analogy, if you've seen these, I've used some, and I'm not that old, but they're called transparencies. You know, the really old projectors, the overhead ones, and you would like set these like transparent pieces of film on there, not pieces of film, little like plastic pages, and you'd set them on there, and they would each have different parts of a picture. They'd form the whole thing, so people would use it for things like blueprints. That's what's going on here, is that there's these different themes that we can kind of take, and once you look at all the themes together, that's when you start to get a fuller picture of what's going on. And so I'm going to look at this through different lenses, through different layers, and there's quite a few. So hang in there, but I think it will help this come alive quite a bit more. The first one is fame. Look at all those stick figures. So we've mentioned a few times that Mark is pointing Jesus out to us. He's revealing Jesus to us as someone who drew crowds in and had immense fame. From chapter 1, that's been a thing. And this kind of continues. So everywhere Jesus goes in chapter 5, like the theme of crowds is amplified. So he's speaking to a crowd in chapter 4, and he goes and they go on the journey on the boat across the Sea of Galilee. I usually, in the past, have pictured that scene being just him on a boat with the disciples, but it says there are other boats. So even when they're sailing, they don't really have privacy. It's like a crowd. It's like, what? And then he gets to the other side, and the demon-possessed man runs up, and somehow, very quickly, I mean, thousands of demons are there potentially, but then also like everyone from the area comes and asks him to leave, and he's like, okay. And they go back, and he's immediately greeted by a crowd. Somehow he's turned Galilee, which is like an ancient fishing town, into like a New York subway, because apparently like everyone's crowding in on him. And even when he goes in to heal the little girl, there's a group of people in there that he has to shoot out. You just get almost like this suffocating sense of just people everywhere, and it's like, oh my goodness. On one hand, it sounds really rough. On the other hand, it is very impressive. But this leads me to my next lens that I kind of want to see this through. And that's the lens of humanity, of Jesus being a human. So one thing that's very integral to our understanding of Jesus that we haven't really gotten to look at much is that Jesus lived on earth among us as a person, like a human being, and experienced all the things that we experience. Even in the story of Jesus in the storm, I think because I had a vision of Jesus as a kid that like discounted the human side, I would picture him in the storm, like kind of like laying there in the corner, like, like this is such a good prank. Like I made the storm happen so I could teach them a lesson, like faking the sleep. But it's like, no, the disciples took him with them just as he was. And he's asleep in a storm. Like, we're not told he was pretending to sleep. He's asleep in a storm. I can't sleep like in a car unless I'm at 0% energy. Like a year ago, I went on like a 13-hour drive overnight from Colorado to Texas with some friends. And the whole time I was like, wish I could sleep. Incapable of being tired enough, and just sat there, right? Jesus is asleep in a storm on a boat. That's insane. But yeah, he's so exhausted. And it's kind of funny as an illustration, but I think it illustrates this temptation that's plagued the church for really its whole history, which is that we try to either avoid the humanity of Jesus or avoid the divinity of Jesus. So many doctrines kind of discount one or the other. So many heresies do that. And even if we're not intentionally being heretical, I think sometimes we just don't give that the due consideration that it deserves. But Jesus experienced life as a human, guys. Even like within his miracles, it says when the woman who was bleeding touched Jesus' cloak, that he felt the power go out of him. That even these things that are miraculous, that are happening through this incredible faith that he has, and through the Spirit, even as that's happening, he's feeling it manifesting in his body. Like it takes a toll on him. And I think we forget that, but I think there's an intimacy to that picture that we miss a lot. We don't have a ton of time to talk about this. We will be talking about it more, but it's something that's very powerful, that's worth thinking about. Jesus had a body. He got tired, he ate, he slept, got headaches, got sick. He still has a body. He's physical. So the next thing is a theme of begging to Jesus. This is a layer. Not something that we notice a ton up until this point. The leper comes to mind in chapter 1, but it's like unignorable in chapter 5 especially. Happens a lot. So first of all, the disciples, when they wake him up, there's some desperation there. They're like, don't you care if we drown? And Luke's recounting of this event, he quotes the disciples as saying, like, save us, Lord, save us. And then he does, and then he gets to the region of the Gerasenes, and the demon-possessed man falls at Jesus' feet and begs him not to torture him, and then begs him again and again to send the demons away into that nearby herd of pigs. And then when the people in the region hear about this, again, they beg Jesus to leave. In your Bible, it might say beg sometimes and plea sometimes. It's the same word in the Greek. They beg Jesus to leave. And then the man who has been cleansed of these impure spirits begs Jesus to let him come along with him. And then Jairus, when he gets to Jesus, he begs, falls at Jesus' feet. And then the woman, when she's like caught for getting healed, she falls at Jesus' feet. And we're not told that she begs, but I get the impression with the way she's trembling at his feet that she's begging for mercy or favor or something along those lines. She tells Jesus the whole truth. We've got like 5 or 6 instances of people begging, and 3 instances of people specifically falling on their knees at Jesus' feet to beg with him. This is worth noting to me because what kind of person do you fall at the feet of? What kind of person do you beg for something from? Right? You don't see you don't see like an older brother begging to a younger brother for something like please. It's you see a kid begging to their parent. You see people in ancient times begging to kings, begging for mercy, stuff like that. You don't beg to a humble small town guy. You beg to someone with authority. You beg before kings. And we're seeing again that Jesus has authority and Jesus has power. And while we won't be spending a bunch of time in that tonight, I think it's worth to think about how is Jesus using his power in this chapter. Remember, one of our guiding questions for this whole study is how does Jesus use power? And there's sort of the implicit, how do we use power? How should we use power? Is Jesus using his power to get ahead, to get rich? Or is he using his power to help those who are less fortunate? The next theme is the idea of clean versus unclean, cleanness and uncleanness. We touched on this at the end of the very first deep dive all those days ago. We touched on this, that this man who was a leper was considered ritually impure, was considered unclean, religiously and culturally. So yeah, you might remember how it was a big deal for Jesus to reach out his hand and touch the leper because that's supposed to be something that makes you unclean. And even after Jesus heals him, he tells him like, oh, like don't tell anyone about this, but go and perform the ritual purification that you need to. See, the Jews were living under a law of cleanness and uncleanness that came from the Old Testament. In general, this takes some explanation, but these laws were there to remind these people that they're supposed to look different from the world around them. And when you read about the things that they absorbed from the world around them, you're like, I'm glad that they were supposed to look different from that. But these laws of cleanness and uncleanness were supposed to remind them, like, we're supposed to look different. And our God is the most different. Holy means set apart. Our God's completely holy. He's completely pure. And so we want to be a people that is conscious of that, that represents that in the way we live and the way we worship. So when Jesus shows up in the region of the Gerasenes, he's surrounded by unclean things. He's entered Uncleanville. Not a real place. That's dumb. So yeah, first of all, there's a man with, it's called an impure spirit. We're not told demon, we're just told impure spirit, which is, language of uncleanness. This man is surrounded by tombs, like that's where he is, and touching dead things was considered something that made you unclean. So that's 2 strikes. He's cutting himself with stones, which was connected to idol worship in the law. And he's near a herd of pigs, which is the most famous non-kosher, not allowed, unclean meat from the Bible, right? So yeah, it's the most famous unclean animal of all. So there's like 4 or 5 things that are making this man unclean. And it's even more obvious, the uncleanness, because this group of boats follows Jesus across the sea. And everywhere else, at every other scene, we're told there's a crowd, there's all these people. But then he gets there, and it's almost like he's the only one who steps off the boat. Suddenly, those other boats just not mentioned anymore. And it's like they're sort of waiting in the distance, like, oh gosh, like, what's he doing? We're not supposed to be over here. And then I think probably the most meaningful example of uncleanness here is that bleeding woman who had been suffering for 12 years. She was probably, the language here, from what I understand, it refers to something along the lines of like a continuous menstruation, where her body wasn't able to go through the normal cycles. And so there was kind of this continuous flow, which would affect anyone, but I cannot imagine like in that day and age, in that culture, with that medicine that was available. We're even told that she suffered under the hands of many doctors. But the time in which you were menstruating, in which you were bleeding, was considered a time where you were unclean. Not that you were evil, not that there was something evil and wrong about your body. Um, Sort of things that came out of your body were, as a whole, considered unclean in the law. So yeah, there are ways men could be unclean from normal bodily functions as well. But she's been unclean for 12 years. And she sees Jesus, who again is called teacher, a rabbi. So she sees a rabbi who's like supposed to be very clean, and she goes and cuts through the crowd and then touches his cloak, but essentially touches him. That's a no-no. That is, you don't do that. You don't, as someone who's like known for being unclean, cut through a crowd and then touch someone who's supposed to remain clean. It's not good. And that's why when Jesus like looks around for her, she's terrified. She's like, oh my gosh, like I'm healed, but was it worth it? What's about to happen to me? And so that's why she's falling at his knees, and she's trembling with fear. And she tells him the whole story. But what's amazing about the theme of cleanness and uncleanness is that in these interactions between Jesus and the other characters in Mark 4 and 5, the understanding of it was that they should be making him unclean. Like if a clean thing touches an unclean thing, that thing is unclean. They should be making him unclean. But instead, he's making the unclean people clean. Jesus isn't at risk of being made dirty by our stuff. If anything, we are at risk of being made clean by him, which sometimes we don't want as much as we think we do. But yeah, Jesus makes us clean. We don't make him unclean. We could do a whole sermon series on this, but I digress. We have to keep going, but definitely something worth thinking about. The next thing is this idea, this theme that everything comes in parables. You might remember last week, there's the whole like inside outside thing where Jesus explains the parable to the disciples, but then not to these other people. He says, to those on the outside, everything comes in parables. And we were talking about this idea that not just Jesus' parables have symbolism, it's everything he does, it's who he is. Not that he as a person is a metaphor, he's a real person, but that the things that he does have this deeper meaning. And if you kind of sit there and chew on it, you can kind of start to uncover that deeper meaning. So yeah, these things seem simple conceptually. There's a lot of meaning beneath the surface. The calming of the storm is a great example of this. So on one hand, you've probably heard it in some way growing up, even if you didn't grow up in the church. It's a good chance you've heard it. It's okay if you haven't. It'd be really cool to experience that for the first time. But I think we hear it and we're like, miracle number 287 in the book of Mark. Like it just seems like another thing. But on the other hand, it's so much more, because like I said, we've gotten to see Jesus basically at his most human so far in Mark. He's asleep in a storm. But then we also get to see him at his most divine, up to this point at least. So he's asleep because he's exhausted, but then again, he gets up and hushes the wind and the waves and is completely calm. It's like he has a remote for them and he's like, no, thank you. And what's amazing is that the word that is used when Jesus tells the sea to be quiet and be still is the same as the word he uses when he's casting the demon out of the man in the synagogue in chapter 1. And he's like, stop. Like the demon's like saying all of this stuff. And he's like, shush, right? It's this word for muzzling something, right? Just no more. It's powerful imagery. It's like visceral imagery. And we look at the disciples' reaction, and they so far have not really reacted much to miracles, but they're shook. They are shook to the core by this. And they're even more terrified after Jesus calms the storm, which is crazy. It's such a big deal because in their culture and in the Bible, only God has power over the seas. Only Yahweh, the great I Am, has power over the winds and the waves. And you can think about how maybe some of y'all's memories of fear had something to do with weather, storms, stuff like that. Think how terrifying they are now, but imagine not really understanding how they work, not knowing how deep the sea was. No one's been to the bottom of that. You know what I mean? It's just like, how do storms work? You can't predict them. You have much less technology and architecture to withstand storms. It would make you feel very, very small, kind of helpless. And you look throughout the Bible in this, and there's a theme of seas and storms as representing just sort of uncreated total chaos. So in Genesis, before God starts creating anything, the lack of creation is the analogy is sort of like this chaotic water, right? Yeah, it's just like it's water because that to them was terrifying. In Exodus, the Israelites are fleeing from the Egyptians, and they get to the Red Sea, and sort of the culminating miracle of this whole thing isn't any of those plagues, which are insane. It's the splitting of the Red Sea, because that's the point. There's a lot of miracles that Pharaoh's magicians could recreate, some that they couldn't, but that's the point where it's like, all right, let's see what this God is made of. And he proves, like, I'm the one, right? And that's this huge thing. Like, the Exodus becomes emblematic to the Israelites. Couple more examples. In Joshua, when Israel crosses the River Jordan, God stops the flow of the river. Again, like an important thing. They build altars there. And then finally, in the Psalms, you read the different Psalms, and God's power is represented through his ability to control the waves or protect us from the sea. If you want a good example of that, read Psalm 46. So yeah, other prophets in the Bible had done miracles through God. Other prophets experienced God multiplying food and healing people. And the disciples had even been given authority themselves to cast out demons. So those things are all amazing, but they're all within the realm of what God had used people and prophets to do. But commanding the wind and the waves, that's for God. So the disciples, they see the significance of this. Jesus did something that is reserved for God. And so in some way, it's like a parable for them. It leaves them asking questions among themselves. So it shakes them. It's like the rock in the shoe, but they're kind of stuck with it. And they're literally, they're who is this? The wind and the waves obey him. They don't know what to do with that. But I think it's also a parable for us. We often feel as if we're in a storm. We're in an area where we're completely at the mercy of things that are happening to us. There's nothing we can do. And it feels like God doesn't care. And we often accuse him of not caring. We're afraid that he won't protect us. But what's amazing is that when God does show up, we're often even more afraid of him. And we don't know what to do with him. The idea that sometimes we avoid God and that we feel fear in his presence is, I don't know, it's mind-boggling to me, and it's something that I've been thinking about throughout the week, like a parable. Only a couple more themes. Next one is the theme of the inside and the outside, that layer. We've mentioned this before. We're not going to spend much time on this, but it's worth noting that when they get to Jairus' household, we hear that Jesus only takes Peter, James, and John. I would assume Jairus is also coming in with him, but only those people come in with him. And when the mourners don't trust Jesus, when they mock him, he puts them out. He's like, no, you're leaving. Yeah, and so it's interesting because in the parable of the sower, so in chapter 4, the disciples are distinctly on the inside. They're the ones getting explained everything. But when Jesus calms the storm, they exhibit the same fear and confusion of people on the outside. So they're asking questions among themselves, but they're not approaching Jesus and asking him questions, which we've seen that same behavior among the Pharisees, where it's like in chapter 2, Jesus is doing things and they ask questions among themselves, but it's like, he's right there. Go talk to him. But they don't. So apparently, yeah, the inside-outside lines are a little bit blurrier than initially thought. There's a theme of soil. Oh, it's so good. Okay, sorry. chapter 4, the parable of the sower and the soils. Different soils represent different groups of people. But notice something that we're told about that man who Jesus frees from the impure spirits. This is starting in verse 18 of chapter 5. It says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people, tell them how much the Lord has done for you, for he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. So this man who, again, like up till now, his lines in the story have been like just like craziness. He's basically going on a missionary journey, which is amazing. And it's crazy that it was to the Decapolis, because it was these 10 cities that were super important to Greek culture. Which, if you're watching the Q&A, we were talking about how Greek culture, even though Rome was militarily in power, they were still culturally the norm. So this man wasn't some random pig herder who went crazy. He was from a pretty important area culturally. But does this remind you of anything? Here's from the parable of the sower. Others, like seeds sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. The man who Jesus frees from a legion of demons fits the description of the good soil to a T. Everything about that. But he's not at all who you would expect to be good soil. He's a demon-possessed Gentile. Also just in general terrifying. And so, he's not who you'd expect to be good soil. But so far in Mark, that kind of thing has been the case. So you think back to who has done the most extravagant things for Jesus, and so far it's Levi the tax collector, who accepts Jesus, goes to follow him, but also throws this huge banquet. And then it's this man who is possessed by countless demons among tombs in the Gentile region. That's our Hall of Fame so far. And who has Jesus commended the faith of? So far, it's a group of friends who cut a hole in a roof and completely made him stop during his teaching time. It's an unclean woman who broke the rules by touching a rabbi. Whoa. That's crazy. The last layer is secrecy. Really small, but worth noting. We've been noticing the theme of secrecy, and we talked about how Jesus said in chapter 4, whatever is hidden is meant to be disclosed. And at the end of chapter 5, he heals the little girl and gives strict orders not to tell anyone about it. He says, don't tell anyone about this. But I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, you know how I know that this hidden thing ended up being disclosed? Mark wasn't in the room, the room where it happened. So, he was told about it by the time that he wrote it, and scholars say that Mark was probably the earliest written gospel. So even that hidden thing was disclosed. So, kind of applies. These are all layers that help us form a fuller picture, a good idea of what's going on. But there's one layer here that's missing, and it's super, super, super important. But before we do that, I want to take a quick break. And while we take the break, go do some cartwheels, go to the restroom. I want you to chew on this question for a few minutes. And the question is, what does it mean to have faith? What does it mean to have faith? Nice. Faith. Okay. So sorry about that. Okay. The final layer, and one of the most important ones that we're going to talk about, is fear versus faith. Fear versus faith. So you might remember from the first week of Deep Dive, we talked about these guiding questions, and that we've had two guiding questions so far for Mark, and they have been, what does Jesus do with power? And again, what should we do with power? What do we do with power? And then how do people respond to Jesus? Which chapter 4 kind of redefined that as, what kind of soil are the characters? What kind of soil are we? So power, soil are kind of the two things so far. But what I didn't mention is that there are 3 guiding questions. What? Everything I've built my life on. There are 3 guiding questions, and the third one is fear or faith. Fear or faith. So let's take some time to look at the fear and the faith in Mark 5. Fear is mentioned directly in reference to 4 different characters. 4 different characters / groups of characters in these sections. And then faith is mentioned twice, or people having faith is mentioned twice. So first, we're going to look at those first 2 mentions of fear, which are fear without faith. So the first one is when the disciples are on the boat. It's described as this. It says, a furious squall came up, so a really bad storm. The waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down. It was completely calm. He said to the disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. The initial fear that the disciples have that Jesus says, Why are you so afraid, in response to, seems to be pretty directly linked to doubt. It seems like Jesus is responding to the question, don't you care if we drown? And he's pointing out their doubt here. In fact, the word for afraid, when Jesus says, why are you afraid, is really more of a word for doubt. He's like, why are you so full of doubt? Do you still have no faith? And maybe they were doubting whether or not Jesus could save them. But when you read the question of the disciples, it's, don't you care if we drown? So while they obviously, they might not expect him to be able to calm the storm, their doubt seems to be whether or not Jesus actually even cares for their safety. I think a lot of us can relate to this. As a Christian, I don't really doubt that God can answer my prayers. But I do doubt often that he cares enough to, that he wants to. So Jesus gets up, tells the wind to calm down, verbally muzzles the waves. So the physical danger is completely gone. It's completely calm. And we're told the disciples are terrified and that they ask each other, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. And again, only God, or Yahweh, as they knew him in the Hebrew, he was the only one who could do this. And I've spent a lot of time this week chewing on this, trying to figure out, why are the disciples so afraid here? Why are they terrified now that the danger's gone? I think there's something about being in God's presence that's terrifying. As humans, we're afraid of things and afraid of people that are more powerful than us, things that we can't control, things that we can't really understand fully. And I think the terror might be coming from that place. The disciples are catching a glimpse of just how not like other prophets Jesus is, just how different he is. That level of power in a man you thought of just as a teacher isn't just exciting and new, it's terrifying. It's hard to understand. I think this kind of terror of the unknown and the more powerful, it's less understandable to us now because we've convinced ourselves that we can control things more than we can. So outside of the reality of climate change and things like that, we are rarely, if ever, at the mercy of the elements in DFW in 2020. We're very inland. It's just like, it's rare that we're at the mercy of something. We're so in control of things in our lives. But they weren't, so they were familiar with that feeling. The next example of fear comes from the people in the region of the Gerasenes. Again, We are told nothing of people being afraid of the actual threat, that this man has broken chains, broken the irons on his feet. He's crying out in the tombs, cutting himself with stones. So it's basically like something out of a horror movie. We're not told that anyone's afraid of that. I get the impression that they're hurting their pigs, and again, they're just like, oh, he's so loud. Like, stop. But he's terrifying. Like, my gosh. But we are told people are afraid when? Starting in verse 15, it says, when they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Dressed in his right mind, and they're afraid. It says those who had seen it told the people that what had happened to they had told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told them about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. Here I see two kind of primary potential explanations for the fear here. One of them is financial. We're told these people are afraid, but then we're told that the people who had seen Jesus cast the demon out also told everyone about the pigs being driven into the sea and drowning. So maybe they overlooked how good it was that this man was freed from demon possession and focused on the fact that they had lost an entire herd of pigs, which that might have been someone's livelihood. Like that is like an actual financial risk. There's a quote from the NIV application commentary on Mark about this passage, and I think it's super powerful. It says, people can tolerate religion as long as it does not affect business profits. Yikes. The other potential explanation I see from this is the fact that we're told the people are afraid before we're told that they know about the pigs. We're told about the fear then. I wonder if they recognize that Jesus has divine power, if they see the power there, but have a distrust of divine power. And when you think of the kind of gods that the pagans worshipped and that the Greeks and Romans worshipped, yeah, they were not trustworthy. You did not want Greek and Roman gods to be with you. You didn't want their presence. You didn't want Zeus to love you. Not a good thing. So yeah, maybe they have this distrust because their gods are as fickle and as dangerous as humans. So whether it's because of greed or because of a distorted view of God, these people plead with Jesus to leave. So we've had two examples of fear with no faith, and we get two examples of fear that is overcome by faith. The first one is that of the bleeding woman. So again, she sneaks her way through the crowd and touches the hem of Jesus' robe. And we're told that she's thinking, if I can only get to him and I can only touch his robe, then I can be healed. And she is healed, but Jesus feels the power go out from himself, and he asks who touched him, and the disciples are like, what? And then Jesus keeps looking around to see who touched him. It says, we're told, verse 32 and forward, it says, Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Be freed from your suffering. This woman, again, is probably afraid because she thinks Jesus and the people around him are angry with her. She knows that she's been healed, but she also knows that she's unclean. She was probably too afraid to come up and ask to be healed because she sees Jesus walking with the synagogue leader. So now she, an unclean woman, has caused Jesus to stop helping the most important religious man in town. It's the worst situation. So she's afraid of being rejected or punished because of her uncleanness and because she's inconvenienced Jesus. And I can't imagine her fear when finding out that this man's daughter has indeed died because Jesus stopped the journey to talk to her. But as we've seen time and time again, whether it be through the leper or through the impure spirit, Jesus is not made unclean by us. We are made clean by him. And she had enough faith to come to Jesus and touch his robe. And she believed that it would heal her. And Jesus realizes this, and rather than punishing her or asking, why didn't you just come for healing? Why didn't you trust me? Rather than criticizing anything about that, He says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, be freed from your suffering." So she is freed from her suffering because of her faith. And the other person who has faith despite fear is Jairus. You can imagine how desperate he is. I mean, I cannot imagine what it would be like to have a kid who's dying. Like, I get nervous when I see kids run. Like, it's just like makes me so sad to see a kid get hurt, see a kid who's sick. I remember being sick sometimes growing up, and just my mom was so much more affected by it than I was. And he probably knows this is urgent. He knows that she's dying. And so, because of this, he sacrifices his social status and falls on his knees and begs Jesus to come and heal her. And they're going, and then they're stopped by this interaction with this woman who Jesus healed. We aren't told of Jairus complaining to Jesus, which is amazing, considering how other people in Mark treat these issues of uncleanness and religious respect. But I'm sure as this is happening, he's freaking out. It's my daughter, Jesus. It's my daughter. Like, I've been watching her die. This woman has been bleeding for 12 years. Surely she can wait. My daughter doesn't have that kind of time. And we're told that as Jesus is talking to the woman, his greatest fear comes true. Jairus' greatest fear comes true. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" And again, we're told of Jairus. We're not told of Jairus doubting. It's as though he follows Jesus with just this hush of anticipation. And Jesus says, "Don't be afraid, just believe," and he just is with him. And his daughter is healed, like brought back to life, healed. So if we can go ahead and remove these slides. I want to focus on something about this theme of fear versus faith. So it's this. Again, all four groups of characters and characters are afraid of something. Like, everyone has fear here. And I think sometimes we view fear as failure. We view it as something that cancels out faith. Like, if I'm having faith, then why would I be afraid? If I'm afraid that God doesn't love me, I'm afraid that God can't help me, then I have failed at having faith. But all of the characters here, every single character exhibits fear. But what is the difference between the characters that succumb to fear, that don't get what they're seeking, that shoo Jesus away, versus the ones whose faith wins over fear? The ones with faith go to Jesus. That's it. Faith drives them not around fear, but through fear to Jesus. And both times, Jesus helps them and extinguishes their fears. The disciples don't confess Jesus as the Son of God or ask him to explain what just happened. They keep their fear among themselves rather than letting it drive them to Jesus. The people in the region of the Gerasenes don't ask Jesus to help them, even though they've just seen the healing that he can bring. They plead with him to leave. They let their fear force him away. But the bleeding woman overcomes her fear just enough to touch the hem of Jesus' robe. And again, she overcomes her fear just enough to step out from the crowd and fall at his feet and tell the whole truth. Just lay it all out. Jairus overcomes his fear and his hopelessness just enough to stick with Jesus. And Jesus brings his daughter back from the dead. Was the woman who was bleeding any less afraid than the people in the region of the Gerasenes who pled with Jesus to leave? Was Jairus any less afraid than the disciples on the boat? No, they weren't. Is fear the ideal? Is fear like a good thing? Not at all. No. 1 John tells us that perfect love drives out fear. But should we let fear make us hopeless and convince us that we don't have any faith? Not at all. No. Just go to Jesus. That's all it takes. If you want to know whether or not fear is coming from a sinful place for you, just ask yourself, does my fear drive me towards God or away from God? Which, side note, the same thing I think applies to feelings of conviction versus shame. Is it driving me towards God or away from God? That's the measurement. If your fear drives you away from God, then there's something you need to repent of and turn around. And again, repent and believe the good news there. But if despite your fear you are going to Jesus, if despite your fear you're going to Jesus, you don't need to repent. You don't need to confess anything. You can be open and get help, but you don't need to feel bad about it. You just hear the encouraging word that's just be patient. Like if you keep going to Jesus through pain, there's healing there. Just keep going to Jesus. Let his perfect love drive that fear out. Keep going to Jesus. Keep going to Jesus. So I want to end tonight with a fill in the blank journaling exercise. So get out your journal, get out your phone, whatever you can write on. And if you believe in Jesus, I want you to fill in the blank in the following sentence. And if not, I would just highly recommend you just kind of listen and observe other people's things and just think about them. But if you believe in Jesus, fill in the blank in the following sentence. I am afraid of blank, but I will keep going to Jesus. I'm afraid of blank, but I will keep going to Jesus. And when I say go to Jesus, I mean pursuing him in prayer, pursuing him in community, choosing to trust him to the best of your ability. Here are a few examples. I'm afraid of losing my family or my friends to COVID, but I'll keep going to Jesus. I'm afraid of graduating and not finding a job, but I will keep going to Jesus. I'm afraid of graduating and losing my friends, but I will keep going to Jesus. I'm afraid of never getting past my anxiety, but I will keep going to Jesus. That last one was my answer. As you come up with your answers, I want to encourage you to type your answers in the chat or to share them with a friend or a group of friends. So again, I'm afraid of blank, but I'll keep going to Jesus. Let's put up a timer for like 3 minutes and just reflect on that together. All right. Yeah, I really hope that you got the time to do that, that God used it. Again, please share that in the chat, and share it with your friends. But I am going to pray, and then we're going to go to our song of the week from my good friend Luke Kaufman. Um, God, thank you so much for just being a God who brings healing, being a God who can handle our stuff. But God, I look at my own heart and I look at other people's lives around me, and I just see fear as a constant thing, that just kind of plagues us and makes it harder to follow you, in a lot of ways. God, I just ask that you would give us peace, but also that you would give us the strength and the faith to keep going to you and keep, just growing in obedience. And it's in your name I pray. Amen. Song.
What's up, guys? I'm Luke, and I'm going to be sharing the song of the week. It's a song that has been around for a while, but it's something that continues to speak to me in a lot of different places in life, and so that's why I've decided to pick it today. I want to start with some scripture, though. I'm in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 and on. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And it's this idea that I think this song focuses on, because it goes through this process and paints this picture of someone who's struggling with anger, with fear, with doubt, with confusion, with questions, and then remembrance of God's grace, remembrance of who God is, remembering that faith is not about having every answer, but it's about having confidence in what we hope for, and it's the evidence of what we don't see. And so it's that I want to focus on, that in a tough time, in a different time, in a time with lots of change, it's important that we remember that our faith is not built just on what we see, but that there is so much that we don't see, and those things are eternal. And I think in this time, that's remembering God's love, remembering what God's done for us, remembering what he's going to do for us in Jesus, what is coming, a time when there will be no mourning or crying or pain. And that will help us to persevere, to see God in our lives right now, and to grow our faith. So thanks for having me, guys. I hope you enjoy the song.